So I'll just explain for everybody first what MILE actually does, generally speaking, and then I'll give you the opportunity to start the lecture. So MILE is a researcher. He's a biologist and a philosopher, a researcher at the CNRS, I guess, right? At the French, Paris CNRS Institute. What's really interesting about his work is that he's sort of one member of a larger group that works on the question of the nature of life by looking at the sort of inherent historicity of life and the way that the constraints basically shape living beings and life as a process. So the usual way is to define living entities, their structure, think about the evolutionary laws that govern it, or sort of evolutionary regularities. But the other way is to actually see how various constraints and various levels, the very diverse constraints, accumulated over time as a kind of a historical evolutionary process. And basically we can explain and sort of find out all sorts of primary sort of crucial features of living systems by looking at them in this way. So in a way, I mean, it's somewhat simplistic, but in a way, it's more akin to how physicists maybe would look at life rather than evolutionary biologists, or sort of a mixture rather of the two to try and find certain almost physical patterns, but at different levels to find out actually about life. I also welcome you to look at Mile's papers and his co-authored papers and his own papers on these topics on his website. And now I will leave you. So you can just sort of maybe give us a hint how long you're going to be talking, and then maybe question period after that. So, okay. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. I call this first course, "What is this animal?" Because the question that I want to raise here is, how do we define theoretically and the objects that we work with in biology, and there are very deep, I think, underlying epistemological questions. So my focus is how we can understand current living beings. And by current, I don't mean just right now, but let's say once life appeared, so it's current plus minus a few billion years. And the related question is, how do we write about biological objects? Because writing is a key part of scientific activity. In biology, there is a logos, it's a discourse, but this logos goes through writing. And in physics, writing is for large part mathematical, which is somewhat specific. So that's something that I want to problematize today. So my entry point and my method is mostly based on epistemological questions, that is to say, how we do understand things, and also theoretical questions, that is to say, the way we think living beings work in a sense, whatever work means. This can mean and can include the question of mathematics and the role that it can play in biology, but not always. So mathematics is an option here. Now, an important part of my method is also the comparison with the theories of physics, That is to say, not just the specific theories, but the way to theorize in physics. So this way is somewhat specific in the sense that mathematics are really at the core of the theorization. And at the same time, in a sense, in spite of this specificity, physics is also used as a model of science, since it was, in a sense, the first developed natural science, completely developed. And it is sometimes a problem, but I will go back to that. Now, some things that I also want to bring up before digging in the main part of this course is that there is currently, at least it's my analysis and not just mine, a problem with theorization in science in general, and a deficit of theorization. In biology, it's especially the case in fields like molecular biology, cellular biology, development biology, where work is basically seen as being only experimental work. And the result is that theorization itself, the work of theorization, is left behind. And this has a very structuring or destructuring consequences for sciences and for biology as a field. The first one is a fragmentation of scientific discourse. That is to say, if there is no effort to rethink situations, then scientific work on specific question, and there is no bridge that is built between these different questions and way to address them. So there is a fragmentation in always more specific subfields. A second consequence of this lack of theorization is the accumulation of contradiction. Again, in biology, for example, biology is based on the word logos, and scientists should take care of their logos, notably trying to avoid contradiction. And so without a specific work dedicated to that, these contradictions accumulate. So they accumulate both for theoretical reasons, for example, the inconsistencies in the use of the term information in biology, but also for empirical reasons. For example, the development of epigenetic as a field of experimental biology is, to an extent at least, in contradiction with the classical view of molecular biology. So this kind of contradiction needs a specific theoretical care to overcome them. And without this care, there is a deficit in the rationality of scientific discourses. An interesting example is also in the field of immunology. In immunology, there are various theories. One of them, the clonal theory, is a bit old-fashioned. It has problems. There are things that it cannot explain. And it's still used to explain vaccine in the general public. And actually, a part of the anti-vax movement built on the limits of the theories to shape their discourse, which is not a rational discourse. So it's very important for me to really emphasize that theoretical work is absolutely necessary for sciences if sciences are to produce rational discourses. So now that I've set the stage a little bit, I will narrow my focus. And the key question for me, at least in this course, is how do we describe or define theoretically the objects that scientists are working on in biology? And here I will show a little bit of a contradiction, or at least something that is not thought through, which is the question of what is, let's say, a chicken for physicists. It's something that I've used in debates, and it always works, in a sense, to show that there is a problem. So physicists typically and often, not always, but often have an imperialist stance in biology. That is to say, they say that with their paradigm, their epistemology, they can understand all kinds of phenomena and possibly all biological phenomena. Now, for physicists who are really working, who have a hands-on work in biology, they have to say what kind of organisms they work with. For example, they can work on the lung morphogenesis in chicken. And then it's possible to show that there is something that doesn't work in their discourse by bringing up the question of what a chicken is. Usually, typically, physicists can answer that by relying on the epistemology of physics. And I will explain how it works in biology, because there is a part of biology that focuses on this question. But this part should not be, let's say, left in the margin of biology. It's actually structuring, from my perspective, all biology discourses, because it's relevant in all practical cases. That is to say, biologists always work on chicken, mice, and so on. So before entering this specific question of what a chicken is, I want to bring up that there are different ways in sciences to generate intelligibility of phenomena, that is to say, different schema that can be used to theorize and define objects. So the first one is typically the one of physics, and we could call it relational, and it's also typically ahistorical. So the way to define an object in physics is by relying on causal relations. So saying causal relations per se is not sufficient, because they have to be addressed more precisely. They have to be made explicit. And so in physics, it's this making explicit of causal relation is based typically on invariance and symmetries. Symmetries being transformations that maintain invariance of an intended property. And I will give you plenty of examples. Another workhorse to define causal relations in physics is also optimization principles. So maybe the simplest one that you probably all have heard about is a case of entropy maximization for an isolated system. That is to say, an isolated system always will tend towards maximum entropy. So to really emphasize that this schema and all schemas that I will talk about are very practical things, I will just take this simple example, which is the gravitation pulling on acting on two objects. That's to say, two objects interacting through gravitation. And what I've written is just the basic equations that describe this situation. So with two objects that interact via gravitation. So you have, in this situation, you have two equations that describe the motion of the two objects and the initial conditions, that is to say, the initial position on the right. I could draw a little bit. So initial position here and initial velocity. So all of that is in 3D, of course, it's in space. So now, what are the underlying symmetries that are also explicit in the equations? So first of all, you have the symmetry that stem from the theoretical framework, which is here, firstly, Galilean relativity. So you have a symmetry by uniform translation. By uniform, I could also say global. That is to say, if you move all objects, so here the two objects, uniformly, then the equation remains the same. Everything remains the same, but the position up to this translation. It's the same for rotations. The interaction do not change. So maybe just for the translation, to emphasize things a little bit more, the translation, the uniformity by the symmetry by translation is shown by this term very explicitly. Why? Because if you add something to x2 and something to x1, since there is a minus between the two, they cancel each other. And r is the distance between the two objects. So when you translate the two objects, the distance does not change. So that's what I mean also by saying that the symmetries shape the equations. And they also can be used in everyday life by physicists to check whether they made a computation mistake. That is to say, if the absolute position of the object matters, then it means that there is a mistake somewhere. And again, to emphasize the meaning of all that, the point of being symmetric by translation is that there is no absolute origin to the universe, spatial origin. There is no center, if you will. That's something that was debated by physicists around the notion of ether or ether. I'm not sure about the English spelling, the English pronunciation. But the key point is that here we are talking about the structure of equation on the one side and about the existence of something like a center to the universe on the other. So the two things are deeply related and they are closely related to each other. So now something that I emphasize in my slide is the case of time translations. This is to say, if the phenomenon appears or takes place later, it doesn't change anything, which means that there is no origin to time. And that's also how physics is explicitly ahistorical, in the sense that time has no origin in this theory, but it's the same in general relativity. And just, I won't expand too much on that, but in a more technical way, in a more involved way mathematically, so the invariants that you've all heard about, so momentum for an isolated system, energy for an isolated system, and so on, they are connected to symmetries by Noether theorem, which is really a fundamental theorem for physics. And so that the conservation of energy is connected to symmetry by time translation. So conservation of energy and the lack of origin to time, if you want, are really two intertwined notions in physics. Now, of course, there is a Big Bang question, but the Big Bang question is actually very difficult to connect to the main theories of physics. It involves a lot of tinkering. So I won't discuss that. I'm not a specialist of that, but it's to show that there is a problem here. Now, of course, when talking about symmetries, there are also some symmetries that are specific to a given situation. And these symmetries, so they are not theoretical, they are ad hoc, but they are also very useful, again, in everyday life for physicists. So in this case, for example, there is the assumption that nothing else interacts on the system. So in a sense, you have two objects that have a mass that interact together, and there is nothing else outside. So they are, in a sense, in a completely empty universe. Now, there is another very simple symmetry that if there is no initial momentum, the two objects define an axis, and then the rotation by these axes are also symmetries. So those are very ad hoc symmetries. There is another one that could be seen as theoretical or specific to some situation, depending on your perspective. It's a question of time reversal. So time reversal symmetry corresponds to the question of the time arrow in physics. And so the idea is that for some equations, like the one of classical mechanics for gravitation and electromagnetism, so these two fundamental forces, there is nothing that changes if you invert the flow of time. That is to say, you change t by minus t or dt by minus dt. What is this symmetry? It means that you cannot distinguish on the basis of fundamental laws whether a movie is played forward or backward. And there is a fundamental field in physics where this symmetry is broken. It's thermodynamics, because the production of entropy gives a direction to the flow of time. So now in classical mechanics, you can have some friction. In this case, time becomes irreversible and gets an arrow. Now, so I talked for now about very technical symmetries, at least symmetries that are embedded in the mathematics, but some are a bit less technical, but are still fundamental from an epistemological perspective. And maybe the main one is a notion that when time flows, that is to say, when the motion takes place, these equations remain valid, whatever happens to the variable. And it is true also if you change the system. For example, you take two objects with different masses or whatever. So this genericity of the equation can be seen as a symmetry. It is to say a lot of things can change the equation. The equations remain the same and they remain valid. And so, of course, a big part of this equation is justified by theoretical symmetries. So typically the one I discussed before and others. Now, there are also some symmetries that are, in a sense, assumed, but are not formal at all. So, for example, it doesn't matter whether the objects are composed of different things or have different colors or whatever. And again, these can be seen as symmetries because it means that you can substitute different objects to each other. And nothing changes for the determination of the system. So there are also these symmetries that are implicit. So now a concept that underlies all of these this physical approach to understanding phenomena is the concept of genericity. It's scarcely discussed as such, and at the same time, I think it's very important to understand how physicists work on their objects. So the idea of genericity is that instead of thinking about a specific situation and pointwise situation, you are thinking about a generic situation, that is to say, a situation that can correspond to a diversity of concrete objects or mathematical values, for example, if you are talking about variables. So, for example, when talking about a light ray or an object of mass m, you are talking about, even in the common language, about a light ray and an object, and you can still make very precise predictions on those, like their speed, like building a model. So you're not talking about something specific, you're talking really in a generic way. Now, this again is also relevant at the level of equations, so in a more technical way. For example, the equations that I showed before, they were about x, m, x1, x2, m1, m2, and so on. So those are variables. They are not associated to a specific value. And it's critical. Why? Because the symmetries can be pulled out only if you have something generic, that is to say, if you can operate transformations. And it's also even more critical when you are looking at a trajectory. So you need equations that are valid for any time point and any space point, right? This notion of genericity can also be relevant in mathematics. For example, you can make proofs on triangles, for example, by just taking any triangle and making your construction, and you then state that your construction doesn't use any specificity from this triangle, and then it's a general proof. And so this can be refined. Now, genericity can have also metric aspects. So, for example, when you say that something is true for almost any real number, for example. So the idea is that this idea of genericity as a metric is critical, for example, in thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, when you say that a system will tend to maximum entropy, well, it will, except for special cases, but that are extremely unlikely. But so this is more technical. Now, there are parts of physics like self-organization, so I think you've heard a bit about it already, where there is something like a dependence on the past that starts to pop out. But my criticism with respect to them is that they still live in the world that I described before, that is to say, a world that is primarily ahistorical. And actually, it's interesting to have a bit of an idea of how it works technically in physics in those situations where there is a bit of a dependence on the past. So the example that I will describe here is a very simple one. It's one of phase transition, which is mostly described by this equation, which describes the energy of the system. So imagine you have a grid, and this grid, all squares of this grid can be either 1 or -1, which below corresponds to white and black. Just a preliminary remark is then that there is a symmetry here, which means that if you replace black by white and white by black, nothing changes ultimately in this equation. So what is it that happens in this kind of situation that is interesting? Well, what happens is that in these systems, there is something called the temperature, and the temperature is basically how much the energy matters in the determination. So if the temperature is extremely high, energy doesn't matter, every square is random, and that's what you see at the bottom right here. Now, if you cool down, energy matters more and more, and what happens when energy matters more and more is that the squares that are adjacent tend to be more and more alike. And this leads to a phase transition, a brutal change in the system, where one direction, either black or white, so either positive or negative, dominates the system. And this domination by one direction corresponds to what is called a spontaneous symmetry breaking. That is to say, the initial situation were set as symmetric by the change between black and white. And overall, the system on average was symmetric. That is to say, it's a gray that is here. And after the symmetry breaking, one direction is privileged. And so this kind of change in a system has specific properties. So the first one is that it's typically random, and it is the case for a very simple reason, that the initial situation is symmetric. So the asymmetry doesn't come from the system, so it comes from randomness. And this asymmetry leads to a minimal kind of historicity, that is to say, the way the system branched is set, and to revert it, you have to pull back the whole system. For example, if we are talking about ferromagnetic systems, then you need a big field to make it switch to the other side, to the other branch. So, and the key point here is that the main determination of the system, that is to say the equation here with the H, remains ahistorical. What changes is only the state of the system. So the equations are still set in stone, they are still ahistorical, at least at the microscopic level. And it's only at the macroscopic level that you have the asymmetry, and it goes through a change of state and not by a change of equations. So you have a kind of epistemological hierarchy in this situation where symmetry and equation are set, and still on this basis, by changes of states, you can have interesting changes with a bit of minimal historicity, if you will, but that are still framed by invariance and fundamental symmetries. Now, there is another way to think about things, and a more historical way in a sense, but not completely historical. And that's to build identities of objects on the basis of their origin. So here we are not in physics at all. And this schema that we could name it origin thinking, is not actually that present in sciences, at least not explicitly, but it's very present in philosophy and in politics. So it's still a bit present in sciences. So the symmetry breaking that I showed you, in a sense, meant that the symmetry breaking event is the origin of the object in its final state, and in a sense determines this object. In a sense also, but it's a bit informal, when we are thinking that ecosystems without the actions of human, that is to say a not anthropized ecosystem, is more natural, or is more of an ecosystem, is in a sense than an ecosystem that is anthropized. We are thinking also in terms of origin. Now in a far more explicit and rigorous way, in Freud, for example, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, there is a thinking of the origin of life, actually, that is fundamental for Freud, that is necessary for Freud, and it's by looking at this origin that he managed to build his theoretical framework. Another situation a bit like that is when you think about machines, and in a sense also about living beings. It is to say the machine or the living beings, their identity is more, in a sense, given by, so for a machine, it's a new machine that works than a machine that is a bit aged and that doesn't work very well. It's the identity also that the designer gave to the machine. And the reference for physiology is typically more an adult and not an elderly specimen. So this schema of thinking, you can find more on this in articles by Shajmohan and Divya Dwivedi. But the consequences of this schema that is not used formally in biology, but that is used informally in biology, is that a lot of scientists who works on the origin of life think that if we make huge progress on this question, then we will understand current living beings far better. And it's not obvious at all. And I want to ask this question: will we make a breakthrough in understanding current living beings, and so in medicine, for example, too, if we manage to construct self-replicating protocells? So we will make progress, of course, in science in general if we manage to do that. But will we understand ecosystems better, or even cells better? It's not obvious at all. And so what I want to criticize here is the idea that origins, in a sense, are more fundamental or over-determine objects in sciences. But there is another way to refer to the past, and that's something that I will expand on in the next section of the course, is when you use the past as an invariant that can be used as a reference. It might be a bit abstract, but I will really explain that in far greater details in the next section. The key point and the key difference between the two stances is that in the previous case, the origin was used to give the identity of the object, whereas in this case, it's used as a reference to, in a sense, identify the object, which is really not the same logic. And so, since I will expand on the biology later, I can just give a very informal example. In the administration, at least it's the way it's done in France, to identify people, the parents, the place of birth, and so on are recorded, so typically in the hospital. And it's a way to identify people, to then give them passports and so on. So that's how the administration does it. And the key point is that this way to identify people by, in a sense, their origin does not define at all what people do. It's not stated what will be the future work or the age and so on of people this way. So referring to the past can really be done in different ways, and that's something that I will develop in the next section. But maybe we can make a small break for questions at this point.
I want to talk about something from the point of epistemology. Mm-hmm. In naturalistic epistemology, we have epistemologists that always rely on past. You know, we form our beliefs in some kind of way, and there is some kind of cognitive architecture that was evolved from the past. But I think that many mistakes in epistemology and different philosophical disciplines come from the wrong understanding of the past. You know, we approach the past as some kind of, I don't know, linear evolutionary process, and the past can be very, I don't know, divergent. It could be something happened and went linear, but then something else happened and confused that function. And I think the past is anthropomorphized in the philosophy often, and it is not understood as in, I don't know, biology maybe. That is my comment. I don't think, my question is, what do you think about the different understanding of the past in different sciences?
It's it's a broad question, but I'm not sure whether you asked actually about, in a sense, history of science and historical understanding in sciences, which is two different things. There is one crossing of the two, which is a case of human history, and in the case of human history, like in the history of science, doing the working on the past is also always reconstructing the past in one way or another. And so it's pushing some rationality on or anthropomorphizing, if you want, the historical events. Now, in general, for example, I will say physics is different than biology, because physics understands the past on the basis of laws that are assumed as invariant. And it's this way that you can retrodict, for example, the positions in the solar system based on the same equations than you predict them. Whereas in biology, it's more about traces that you can find either in fossils that matter or in living matter. And actually, that's the second part will be, in a sense, about that. So maybe we can come back to this question later, and I will proceed to the next section of the course.
I also have one question.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going back to the set of two equations that you use to demonstrate certain features of mathematical equations we use to describe physical systems. So the way I see it is, on the left-hand side, you had basically terms that reflect Newton's second law, right? And on the right-hand side, you have universal law of gravitation, basically there, right? So apart from other features that those equations exhibit, you also mentioned that they are time invariant, right? So I'm wondering up to which extent that time invariance is an artificial property of those equations and actually a shortcomings of those equations, because we know that every time we drop something, or if we have a case where two gravitational bodies attract each other, they always move one towards the other, right? They never repulse them. So actual physical system described by universal law of gravitation is one directional. The mass bodies will come closer to each other, right? While those equations actually don't show that. So I was thinking, do we actually have a problem with equations there? Because they don't show, like mechanical laws of motion, that they are time invariant, while actually we have always bodies attracting each other. So in some sense, that equation, the gravitational law, should have built-in feature that shows that masses are coming closer to each other when they are close to each other, right? When they attract each other. So are we talking here about time invariance as a property of the equations and only equations, or there are some implications on the physical system, because the physical system seems to be time variant in the sense that it always moves in one direction, while equations don't show that?
So here we are talking about the inversion of the flow of time. So not the question of origin of time. which is a different one. If you invert the equation, you also invert the initial condition on the velocities. So what happens is that gravitation works in the same way in one direction than in the other. So it's always pulling if you analyze things. But what is different, for example, if you have two systems that attract each other and it makes an ellipse, then it's just the way the ellipse is traveled that will be inverted if you invert time. It's the same, in a sense, it's a bit counterintuitive, but if you have a free fall of an object, and let's say it's very simple, so it goes through, but then what we will have is also an ellipse that is limited to a segment. So if you invert things, it's the same too. So this idea of pulling, well, it's really in our everyday life, but mathematically doesn't change the thing. The only thing that changes is friction, really, at this level at least. Because friction dissipates energy, and that's why, in a sense, if you have something bouncing, the bounces become smaller and smaller over time, and that's where direction of time pops out, because otherwise it's putting this way and this way, you reverse time, it still bounces this way. So there is really no change here. But the question of origin, so there is this problem with the Big Bang, but it's really a deep problem, because what underlies this time translation is time symmetries. Sorry. What underlies this time translation is energy conservation, or you can take it the other way around, that is to say, energy conservation corresponds to time translation, which means that if you are talking about origin of time, then you're destroying a key concept of physics, which is energy conservation. So it's something that is really really deep here, deeply embedded in the theories, and that's part of the reason why work around the Big Bang is so complex. It's difficult theoretically.
Thank you.
So if there is no other question, I will proceed to the next part. So in the next part, I will talk about the classification of living beings, which really use the last schema I presented. And the idea is that this classification of the living beings, it's actually what provides the names that are used every day in biology, like a mouse, which is more technically Mus musculus, or a rat, Ratus ratus, and so on. And the issue of the classification has a history that is, and it's a good idea to have this history in mind. For a large part, it came first from an Aristotelian logic, with the idea that species, the terminology is a bit problematic, but species will be, or let's say individual who correspond to species, and in a sense, this species would have an essence that will be fixed. And it came also historically with the idea of a scale of beings in the world that encompasses both the inanimate and the animate, and that would range from minerals to the divine, going through plants, animals that are above plants, humans that are above animals, then angels, and then God. And so I'm going very fast here in the history, but In a sense, Darwin is the one who pushed it more because he was not the first transformist, but Darwin focused a lot on genealogies as a way to organize the diversity of the living world, which again is a very different way to think that than the natural theology that went in between and stated that different beings had an essence and at a different specific spot that was fixed in the world and in ecosystems. But Darwin's view didn't come to completion very fast. Instead, there were all kinds of intermediaries mixing the idea of a scale of beings and the idea of genealogy that Darwin pushed forward. So, for example, here you have the tree of life as seen by Ernst Haeckel and the late Ernst Haeckel. And what you see here is that the man is still at the top of the tree, and in a sense, it's a teleological view of evolution where there is man as a name, and this view showed in the classification, which started before Darwinism, of course, but continued afterwards. And it showed by terms like invertebrates or agnates. So agnates are animals without a jaw. And these terms are privatives. They are not about positive properties that living beings had, some living beings have. Instead, they are privative, and by comparison with something that will be a good thing to have, let's say, which are the things that men have. I keep men because there is also this masculine connotation to it. So there was hybrids between Darwin's view and the idea of a scale of being. And some views distance themselves from the idea of a scale of being, but still try to blend or to mix together two very different notions, which are on the one side the genealogy, and on the other side the way living beings live, or their morphology, or their body plan, and things like that. So it's this hybrid view is one of evolutionary systematics, and so it combines genealogy and some aspects of phenotypes. And the modern view, and the one that is really mainstream and used in the classification of living beings, is called the phylogenetic systematics. And it only cares about genealogy and not about body plans. But it has also somewhat rigorous epistemology and rigorous concepts. So I will present them briefly now. And you can see already that the output of this method is very different. Here it's presented in a circular way. It can be presented in different ways. But the circular way is nice in the sense that it's, even though it's what is presented is mathematically a tree, there is no the idea of progress that will be done here. And the circular representation also emphasizes a key concept in this method, is that actual living beings are only at the circumference of this circle, and all other elements here in the tree, all other branching points, are actually abstract constructs or abstract notions. So, for example, if you have fossils, they are also here at the end of the tree. And so the breakthrough in the methodology for this method of classification was done by Hennig, who proposed a mathematical method to construct this kind of classifications. So now I will present some very basic concepts. So maybe the first and the key notion in the phylogenetic systematics is the notion of a monophyletic group. And the idea of the idea behind that is that in a group you can only put a common ancestor and all the descent of the common ancestor, so you cannot remove arbitrarily some of the descent. So, for example, if you want to talk about reptiles, you have there are some animals that used to be called reptiles, but then you have to take all the descent of the common ancestor of these animals, which means that you have to include birds, because birds descend from dinosaurs, and dinosaurs clearly descend from some kind of reptile, right? So, and the same logic applies to dinosaurs. So since birds descend from dinosaurs, then you have to include birds in the group dinosaurs, which means that chickens are dinosaurs, and dinosaurs did not disappear, which in a sense is good news. So the groups that are not monophyletic are not deemed acceptable groups. And they can be called paraphyletic. So, for example, reptile, as you spontaneously conceive them, so without birds, is a paraphyletic group. Another notion is polyphily. It's when you don't include the common ancestors, for example. So, but really, the key notion is the notion of monophyletic group, and the monophyletic group are the only acceptable groups. Now, with this comes a central distinction to evolutionary biology. It's a distinction between analogies and homologies. So when you're looking at characters, some may have the same functions, like the wings of birds, insects, or bats, but they don't have the common origin. And by contrast, the forelimbs of tetrapods, for example, have a common origin. And you can also point the different bones that match or that correspond in different tetrapods. And those are called homologous characters. And what is important here is two things. First, the ultimate distinction between an analogy and an homology requires to have a classification, that is to say, to know what are the common ancestors. So when you are doing the classification, you make guesses on what can be homologies, and you are not interested in analogies per se, so you make guesses on homologies primarily. And it's once you have a classification or an attempt at a classification that you can say, okay, this was actually not an homology, this was an analogy, and we got sidetracked. Now, even in this picture, there is something else that you can see that is very important, is that when doing the classification, you're not really concerned about biological functions, because biological functions can lead parts to have similar shapes, even though they don't have a common origin. So what is more interesting is to look at how parts articulate with each other. So here, for example, in the forelimbs, you can see that there are always the same kind of bones that are connected or that are placed next to the same bones and so on. And the function and the specific shape of these bones are quite different depending on the cases. Here, depending on the milieu actually in which the different organisms live. So homology here is a key concept, and analogy is a little bit like paraphyletic groups. There are things to avoid or that are forbidden. So Now imagine you have a bunch of organisms. So sorry, it's in French, the graph, but you have frog, you have a turtle, a crocodile, and a pigeon. And you want to assess who are the most closely related to each other. So you point out several features, anatomical features typically. And then you can draw different possible trees. And the idea is that the most likely tree, which is a principle of parsimony, is a tree where the least novelties took place in evolution. So in this case, it's a tree that is at the left. And the other trees require things to appear several times. So it's less likely for things that look similar to appear several times. So in a sense, the most likely tree is the one that minimize the number of analogies. But what is interesting is that even in this case, there is a feature that appears twice. It's a feature 4 here. And the feature 4 is what? It's the fact to have a hardened beak. And so it exists in birds and in some turtles. And then something that you could hesitate, is it between the beak of the turtle and the beak of the bird? Is it something that appeared once and propagated, or is it something that appeared twice? Well, it's ultimately the classification that you can build that defines in which situation you are, so analogy or homologies. As I said a little bit, when you are trying to build a classification, you focus on characters and aspects of characters that are not prone to analogies. So, for example, a focus with a relationship between parts rather than a specific shape. Focus on some non-functional aspects instead of aspects that are too functional. And properties that are more conserved. For example, if you want to make to include organisms that diverge a while ago. And so these classifications can be done both on the ground of molecular informations or on the ground of phenotypes. And these two ways to work have different drawbacks and advantages. So what is interesting in molecular data is that it's very rich. And in a sense, it's very accessible now that we have technologies to make high throughput sequencing. But on the other hand, it's not available for fossils. And so there are these shortcomings, and also there can be lateral transfers that jam things up a little bit. So these two levels at which to work are complementary in a sense. Now, in everyday practice, when doing a phylogenetic classification, there is the notion of rooted or not rooted tree. So what people do when they classify, let's say, a group of primates, for example, is to also include an animal that is typically guessed as being very far from this group. Let's say, for example, a rodent, very arbitrary example. And the idea is that in the tree that is constructed, the rodent here provides the root of the tree. What does it mean that it provides the root of the tree? That if you don't have a specific method to point out what is the oldest level, in a sense, in your group, your tree is called unrooted, and it's like in the right side of the picture. So you don't know where it starts from and where is the last common ancestor. So the external group here is used to root the tree and to create a hierarchy, in a sense. Now, the difficulty is that if you are talking about the biosphere and trying to do the tree of life, there is nothing external to it. And that's where Luca can come from too. That is to say, Luca is not just an hypothesis, it's also instrumental in a way when we are talking about the classification of living beings, because Luca, in a sense, is an assumption on where the root of the tree of life is. Once you have done an analysis on the basis of the properties of the different living beings. Now, in the classification, now once we are beyond just drawing the trees, there are also methodological aspects that are very significant, both in practice and for the epistemology of this field. And the properties that or the practice that I want to emphasize here is that the names in the classification, so for example, Homo sapiens or Mus musculus, are defined not as names of group primarily, but primarily as a name of a specific specimen called a type, and that is kept typically in academic institutions or in museums of national history. So the names of the classification, including the higher names like mammals, are defined by a specific specimen that is kept. And this is to be contrasted with physics, for example, where you don't need any sample of light, let's say, to define what light or light at a given spectrum is. Or you don't need a specific specimen or specific object to define what a meter is in the International System of Units. So here, concrete objects play a primary role, and it's due to the lack of a theoretical construction, like in physics, of object as invariants. So, for example, if we go back to the system of International System of Units, the meter definition is based on the speed of light, and the speed of light is set in the vacuum, is set as a constant, as an invariant by relativity theory. So in physics, you have the theoretical construction that ultimately define something like the speed of light, and then you can use a specific light rays to make a mètre étalon, that is to say a sample that is used as a reference for what a meter is. But so in physics, the theory comes first, and in biology, it's a sample that comes first, the specimens that are kept that come first. So in a nutshell, this way to classify things, so it's highly codified, and it's designed also to be robust. That is to say, further discovery can change a little bit the classification, but thanks to this fact that the names are all associated to specific samples, the way to change the classification, in a sense, is automatic if there is a new discovery. And philosophically, so what is used as an invariant here is not the properties of objects. So you will know, for example, that tetrapods, which are supposed to have 4 limbs, include a snake, which do not have any limb. So it's not based on properties, on characters that have to be shared between all the members of a group. Instead, what is really invariant here is the past, that is to say, the common ancestor that defines the group. And of course, this common ancestor is not accessible. So as a proxy, the specimens are used to define groups. So it's a very specific epistemology, very distinct from the one from physics. And that is still at the same time very, very rigorous and tackles this immense and extremely complicated task, which is to classify all the biosphere in spite of the variety and the relentless diversification of living beings. Still, there are some limits to this method. One of them is the existence of lateral transfers, and so that the notion of ancestor can be problematic, especially for microorganisms that share part of their DNA among, between species and not just inside the species. Another problem, for example, is the notion of holobiont, the notion that organisms are actually a mixture of different species with different pasts. And of course, there is a question, the 2 questions that are coupled, the very, very distant past, which is problematic because, in a sense, traces of the very distant past have been erased, even at the molecular level, not always, but often. And the question of living beings that are simple, such as viruses or bacteria. And by simple, I don't mean something abstract or very theoretical. I just mean, for example, when we are using DNA, that DNA sequences are short. And because they are short, it means that erasing things can go very fast, and that we cannot go very deep in the past to some extent. So we can make another short break for questions. So question focused on here on this method of classification of living beings, which is really the standard method currently.
This will be a very smart question. I'm joking. If I understood good, in biology, in epistemological sense, history is very important. Past is very important, and current states are, I don't know, invariant. My comment is, I think in many sciences, when people talk about past, they really are talking about present states. You know, I observe present state and I draw conclusions about what happened in the past. You know, it had to evolve in some way to be like it is now. And again, I'm asking a question about the concept of past in, I don't know, biology.
So in biology, it's very broad, but with respect to the classification, it's a very specific logic, and that is, I think, not discussed enough because it's very original. And in my view, in a sense, what I just exposed is the most original thing epistemologically that exists in natural sciences, by contrast with physics. And the idea is really that you cannot tell at all what mice will do in 10 years or in 100 years. And you are not sure actually about what they actually are doing right now. They can be very different, very diverse, and so on. And so everything changes very deeply in biology. So how do you classify something like that keeps changing in many, many ways, unpredictable ways, and when you have only a very partial access to the objects? So you cannot do like in physics by stating what the causal relationships are. That will be making a model like in physics of a mouse, a prototype mouse. But you know that even if you could do a prototype mouse, maybe in 100 years, the mice will do something different. And you don't embrace the diversity. You only do the prototype of one mouse, for example, or a couple of mice in the labs. So instead of doing the physics method, biologists did something very, very different. Is to say we put all together all the descent of a common ancestor, and that's what groups are. So that, for example, mice are supposed to be all the descent of the common ancestor of mice. And by referring to the past, you're leaving the present and the future completely open. And that's the key trick that they pull here. You refer to the present. The present is to the past, sorry. The past is invariant because it's in the past. It's not changing. And as a result, they can embrace the diversity of the present and the future. So if you follow this logic completely, for example, among Homo sapiens, you have these weird artifacts, which are the cells that are cultivated in labs, human cell lines. And they are Homo sapiens too, because they are the descent of this common ancestor. So among humans, you have people with vertebrae and limbs and so on, but you also have cells that live in labs. It's really a change in the way to define things.
So you insist on this ahistoricity of physics, and physics as a sort of a template for ahistorical knowledge. Now, in a way, it's nothing more than a very specific tradition in science, and it's nothing more than a very specific historical trajectory of the development of science. And it's analogous, this sort of ahistorical concept of physics. It's sort of analogous to experimenting with and exploring living beings, certain kind of beings, with bacteria in a petri dish in a very isolated, limited sort of a piece of the world, as opposed to looking at, you know, the same bacteria in colonies in the wild. So why I'm saying this? Because everything that you said about that kind of physics is true for this very limited piece of knowledge that we call sort of a traditional textbook physics. But now we know that whatever we say about, say, structure of atoms or stability of atoms is true now and within a particular time frame. Before that, atoms didn't even exist. Electrons didn't do what they're doing now, circle around the nuclei. They were scattering all the time off the protons and so on. Light didn't exist. We know that as well. The universe wasn't transparent at all for, you know, a fairly long period of time. So in a way, there's no substantial difference between biology and physics. I would go that far, and say that it's only a way of developing physics historically that we emphasize that we really were lucky with that part, but now the hard part is coming. We have to sort of understand the evolution of the universe. With biology, we discovered life in the wild, and now we need the opposite. We need like these sort of simpler models in order to understand what's really in the wild. I mean, do you understand what like the point? Or?
Yes. But there are different things. To an extent, I agree with you, but only to an extent. And this for different reasons. Why? One is, in a sense, the lack of diversity in the universe, except when there is life. To say, for example, star classification is very simple, and it's a typical physics classification based on properties, constituents, and so on. And the number of categories of star is very low. Planets are maybe a bit more interesting. Planets are more diversified, and maybe it's at this level that there is even planets without life. That what you say is especially relevant in a sense. So there is this thing of lack of diversity, but still deeply embedded also in the way physicists think. There is this underlying notion of genericity, and it can be exemplified by what is done with particle accelerators. That is to say, in particle accelerators, the idea is to recreate a very local, very high heat, and the idea is to go back in time, in a sense, by doing that. That is to say, by recreating the locally conditions that were close to the beginning of the universe to assess what took place at this time. And in biology, there is no way to do that. You cannot tune any kind of parameter to go back in time. The way people try to do experiments on the origin of life is not by tuning just parameters, it's a kind of design too, but it's a design in order to beat the odds, let's say, because the emergence of life took place in some, over a very long period of time, and on something that is very large, I mean Earth. And if you want to do that in a lab, which is small, and you have only a small quantity of matter, you just try to find a path by which something like protocells can emerge. So it's far more complicated in a sense.
So the key difference then, I mean, if you summarize what you said, is the level of complexity, basically. So, because if in living systems we encounter the level of complexity that we don't really encounter in these other systems that typically are studied by physics. But in a way, that's also the point, that the evolution is really sort of continuous from these physical systems, but historically speaking, physical systems to more complicated ones, like planets. Planets are actually very complicated, even in terms of physics, and so the only difference really is how many series of symmetry breakings took place from the Big Bang, if there was such a thing, to multicellular organisms, emergence of multicellular organisms. So I mean, I sort of insist on this kind of continuity, and then how do we parse it is a different thing, and of course complexity would be the main obstacle for that, epistemologically, or even more than that. But Yeah, I'm just a little bit worried about this sort of portrayal of physical systems as ahistorical as such, right? As being more than I guess that's the sort of part that maybe we agree on.
Yeah, I'm focusing on physics theories and the structure of physics theories versus the structure of what could be a theory or theories in biology. And it's not the same thing to talk about physics objects or the inert in general versus the theories to understand them. My key point, because you can think in terms of progressive complexification, and there are traces of that, for example, atom complexification in the universe with stars that explode and that create new atoms that were not there before, and then chemical complexification again in the inert with more and more chemical species that appear in the universe over time. Stuart Kauffman wrote on that. And that is fine. But at the same time, there is a question of how you build a theory that enables you to address things in also in everyday life, in a sense, for biologists. And for example, I talk more about symmetry changes than symmetry breaking, because if you want to talk about symmetry breaking, you need to have already in the beginning all the symmetries, the equivalents that are set. And then what you're talking about are only changes of states and not changes of equation. So in a sense, you need to set in the beginning all the possibilities of the biosphere, including humans, which is not tractable. So instead, I prefer to talk about symmetry changes. And in a sense, if we talk about symmetry changes or symmetry breaking, the accumulation of those in biology is such that you need a change in both the theory, but also the epistemology. And it's this change that is very radical, in a sense, in the classification, that I really emphasize, because then the challenge is to make hybrids between this epistemology and the one of physics to address current living beings. So actually, in the next section, I will talk a little bit about what you mentioned. Also, it's what are the practices in the lab, with the idea that this epistemology that underlies the classification of living beings, actually it's there also in experimental biologists' everyday practice, but in a far more informal way. And so I theorized this as a question of measurement in biology. So there is a quote by Einstein which says that whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. It's a theory which decides what can be observed. So Einstein made this remark when talking about quantum mechanics and bubble chamber. So in bubble chambers, people saw something that looked like trajectories for particles. But in quantum mechanics, there is no such thing as trajectory, at least not in the classical sense. So Einstein said it's a theory that decides if it's trajectories or not. So those are not trajectories. And the idea is that in biology, there is this question has not been debated too much or has been very little debated. So the question is not about, let's say, a specific measurement device and so on. It's about the articulation between a theoretical construct on the one side and what you can get in observations or experiments. So it's a very general question. And so there are different notions of measurements in physics. The first one is from classical mechanics, and it's just the notion of limited precision. So the state in classical mechanics, it's pointwise, it's a point for positions and for velocities. But the idea is that in observation, we can never access the precise point that corresponds to the state of an object. Instead, we can always observe it with a limited precision. And this is not just a minor remark, because, for example, in chaotic dynamics, what you have is unpredictability in a deterministic framework. So what does it mean? It means that this precision that is always limited with these dynamics, it leads to trajectories that can diverge very fast, sorry, so that however precise you are, you will never be able to do long-range predictions. So, and if you had, even for chaotic dynamics, if you had the perfect pointwise access to the object, then you will be able to do precision like in any other cases. So measurement is, as such, as just limited precision, is really a central notion with ramification in spite of its simplicity. Now, in quantum mechanics, the notion of measurement is more complex. It changes the state of the object, and it's also the locus of randomness that exists in this theory. So in a sense, it's more it's more complex, and it's also mathematically more structured. That is to say, you have specific mathematical objects that describe measurement. I will skip the last one, but what I just wanted to show is that this question of measurement as a fundamental theoretical question, it's really there in physics, and it's worthwhile to ask it in biology. Now, what are the stakes of measurement? Well, in physics, I would say, since we have equations that define theoretically the object, the measurement is mostly about producing quantities by assessing the state of the object. So say the transformation of the object are changes of state. The equations do not change, and they define the object and its determination, but the states change, and the measurement are ways to figure out the state of the object, sometimes by transforming it in quantum mechanics. In biology, the situation is more complex because the regularities that could lead to right equations are not set in stone. They can change. Actually, we call them constraints. And therefore, measurement has to accommodate different things. So the observed quantities, a bit like in physics. So for example, we could measure the mass of a mouse. But we also have to state that the object is a mouse. And so the classification is about that, but the classification is not fine-grained enough. And I will develop that. And we also have to accommodate the resulting uncertainty. So for example, the meaning of the mass of a mouse is a very simple question, but actually a very complex one. What does it mean, the mass of a mouse? Well, it doesn't mean the same if the mouse just eats something, if it drank something a lot. Is it with the hairs, without the hairs, and so on. So the biological meaning of the mass is actually not that well defined, and I will expand on that too. The key notion, I think, to understand measurements in biology is the notion of symmetrization. That is to say, to make equivalent objects that are not genuinely or theoretically equivalent objects. So for example, when we are talking about a mouse, we are not talking about something defined, well-defined like in physics. We are talking about something that can be very diverse, and actually we should talk about this mouse or this mouse or this collection of mice that has been generated in a given way. So how is this symmetrization performed? Well, first by a shared history, and here you should recall the case of the common ancestors in the classification. Shared context, so for example, being in the field, being in the lab, and in the lab in this or that condition. And by the observation of specific properties or constraints. So for example, the body weight of a mouse, or blood samples, blood work showing that these quantities in this chemical is in this concentration and this concentration. So which are ways to assess the health of the mouse. And so the symmetrization can be performed in different ways. It can be just an abstract construct, but it can also be very concrete changes to make mice more symmetric in a way. So the names of systematics are already ways to create equivalence. And so I detailed that earlier, so I won't expand too much on it, but I will just recall that it has this very specific epistemology where objects are defined by a reference to the past, to their past, and also, again, that this reference uses concrete objects and not theoretical constructs. Now, in the lab, there are so more fine-grained practice to do symmetrization. And my key point is that these practices are actually in the same, are relying actually on the same kind of epistemology than the classification, but not the same kind of techniques. So if you consider animals like mammals or birds like chicken that are used in labs, they typically don't come directly from the wild. They come from strains that are raised in then labs. Actually, historically, these strains come from domesticated, for example, mice that then has been used in biological laboratories and has been bred in these laboratories since a century roughly. So these lab mice strains have something that wild animals don't have, that is to say, control of the way they reproduce. So some strains are actually called inbred, that is to say, only animals of the strain reproduce with each other. Some are outbred, that is to say, other specimens are brought in the strain that is kept by a laboratory. In both cases, it's ways to define specific organization to an extent, but those are all indirect ways, that is to say, when biologists report an experiment on a specific strain, they refer to the name of the strain and the laboratory or the animal farm in which the strain is maintained. So there is no specification of their specific organization. But maybe an even simpler case is one of experiments on cells and cell lines, which can be bacteria or for example, mammal cell lines. The idea often, if we want to have very precise experiments, is to start with a clonal population. So people do that by subculture. So you dilute your bacteria, for example, enough so that when you put it in a petri dish, when you put a sample in a petri dish, you actually have only one bacteria, and this bacterium reproduces, and from that you create a population, and then you experiment on this population. But typically you do not just experiment, you also keep samples in the fridge so that this sample can be used to reproduce the experiment. And again, people cannot look into the specific organization of a cell, it's too complicated. So instead, they use a common origin as a proxy, in a sense, to enforce a similarity between these cells, at least to an extent. And then biologists organize things. So for example, if another team want to redo the experiment, they can typically ask for samples to work exactly on the same strain. Because if they work on another strain, there is a possibility that the experiment won't work at all. So what I want to emphasize here is that by controlling the genealogy here, biologists can do experiments that are reproducible and define the objects they work on. And again, it's a definition that is based on origin and not on the properties of the cells or the animal strains. So, and the diversification of living beings never stops, including in laboratory conditions that are completely standardized. So what I'm showing you here are the phylogenetic tree of, yes, it's mice, of laboratory mice. So on the left, you have a fairly large tree in the sense that it encompasses, I think, all the strains that are used. But on the right, you have a more detailed tree that only correspond to this part. So you can see how much, in a sense, biologists are trying to always run behind this dynamic of diversification of living beings. And because of this diversification, to try to do experiments that are reproducible, they have to label and relabel strains when they change over time. So again, even in completely controlled laboratory conditions. And so you could wonder whether these strains really lead to differences or if just minor differences between strains. Well, in an experiment, biologists showed that after the injection of a chemical, depending on the strain, mice produce tumor at a rate going from 0% to 90%. So if you choose the right strain, you will say that something is not carcinogenic. And if you choose another one, you will say that it's carcinogenic and very strongly carcinogenic. So that's a first example. And there are other examples, for example, the Black 6 mouse strain, which is very widely used in biology, as a specific, very specific way to perceive pain, and it completely jammed the work of people who work on pain perception because of this specificity of the strain. So they were actually looking at something that was not representative at all of other mice. They were looking at something that was very specific and maybe also an artifact due to being raised in labs. Now there is another aspect to measurement than just genealogies, but coupled with it, it's how you design the quantities that you can observe. And actually, that's something that is not straightforward. I mentioned the case of the weight of an animal, which is not something that simple. And actually, to illustrate this question, I like the case of allometry. So allometry is a description of how a quantity changes with the mass of the animals involved. And it was found that this relationship seemed to be very regular among mammals, at least mammals and birds here. So when looking at the metabolic rate, which is just oxygen consumption. But actually, if we look a bit deeper into it, we see that for subgroups of the mammals, for example, different slopes can be found. So there has been a huge debate, in a sense, between physicists and biologists, evolutionary biologists, to know whether this beautiful line that you see to the left is correspond to something real or not. And behind that, there are different strategies of symmetrization with respect to quantities. So if you imagine that you're looking at different animals which may have different characters, so S1, for example, doesn't have the circle character, and S2 has a new character, the star character here. So it doesn't have the circle that the common ancestor had. And here there is a new character, for example, and you want to expose them or to measure the same thing between them. And so this can be done in different ways. First of all, you don't do anything, you just measure a quantity like the metabolic rate. And in a sense, that's what the field metabolic rate does. That is to say, people just measure how much oxygen animals consume when they do whatever they want in the field. And when you are doing that, it means that the diversity of relevant characteristics impact the outcome. So the regularities that you will be able to pull out are relatively weak. On the opposite, you could try to tone down everything that is not shared between the different living beings. And that's actually a strategy that is used when defining something called the basal metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate is the metabolic rate of an animal which doesn't do anything. It's not sleeping, but it's not digesting, and so on. And it's a way to bring up the commonalities or the shared properties, shared constraints among the different living beings. Another strategy is to guess that there is that you can expose a limiting factor that will be shared, and it's a strategy when working with the maximal metabolic rate. Again, here the key point is that there is something specific to biology that does not really exist in physics. It's how you handle the fact that the objects that you work with are diverse. And how do you handle it in order to make reproducible experiments? So I will skip that because we are late. And I will just finish with that. The outcome is that there are different strategies to make measurement in biology. The red line here corresponds to, let's say, the core strategies that are polar opposites. One strategy is to symmetrize objects as much as you can, in the sense that you aim to have organizations that are as much as possible the same. So it's the case, for example, where when looking at clonal cell populations, and it helps for reproducibility, of course, because there is less diversity. At the same time, there is always diversity, so it's never perfect. But on the major drawback is that you are looking at a singular situation that is proper to this organization. You don't know if these properties that you see are somewhat generic and shared in a more diverse population. So it's a case for pain reception among mice. As I said, it is very specific in the Black 6 strains, and it means that generalization are not straightforward. So on the opposite, you could embrace some diversity and some lack of control. And it is a case, for example, when looking at the metabolic rate in the wild, in the field metabolic rate, or also some people, some biologists push for the idea of at least working on different strains in an experiment so that the outcomes are not artifacts and can be generalized somewhat. And of course, it's a range. So biologists can go from highly controlled in vitro situations that are as symmetrized as it gets, in biology at least, to completely uncontrolled situation on a complete animal in the wild. And there are other aspects to this diversity of strategies, but I think I will have to stop here and can discuss a little bit. So if I can just add an element, you see when physicists claim that biology is just physics and so on, they still have to accommodate in their practice all these elements of using the names from systematics, talking about strains, and so on. And since they cannot accommodate them with their epistemology or with their theories, it means that there is a strong contradiction. And it's a strong contradiction in the sense that it's not just speculative. It's about the fact that they cannot talk really about the objects that they are working with. And they cannot talk about a part of the operations that they do on their objects. So they can talk about the way they define their objects concretely. So it's a strong shortcoming. And but to overcome this shortcoming, and that will be part of the next course, you have to hybridize the epistemology of physics with these difficulties that stem from biology.